At 8 a.m. on the 28th of February 1991, silence descended over the battlefields of Kuwait and southern Iraq after the coalition halted its stunningly successful 100-hour ground war to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation initiated almost 7 months previously. Against the backdrop of arid desert and burning oil wells, the coalition had used its superior weapons and highly trained combat personnel to wreak havoc on what was then the 4th largest army in the world. The potent images of stealth fighters and pinpoint-accurate laser-guided missiles became the devastating symbols of the futility of resisting the coalition's awesome combat power. The event that triggered the hostilities of January and February 1991 occurred back on the 2nd of August 1990, when Kuwait citizens awoke to the sounds of Iraqi T-72 tanks advancing down the streets of Kuwait City. Iraq, a state led by the brutal dictator Saddam Hussein, head of the Ba'ath Party, had committed an act of unprovoked aggression that shocked the world. Within a few hours that morning, Iraqi forces had occupied all of Kuwait, the tiny emirate of the Al Sabah dynasty. Saddam Hussein said, "Kuwait has been returned to the fold of her motherland, Iraq." By conquering Kuwait, Saddam sent a powerful message to discontented Arabs to overthrow the complacent pro-Western sheikdoms that had been created by the imperialist whims that dominated Arabia's painful colonial past.
The justification for invading Kuwait is, of course, that Kuwait was an artificial state created by Western imperialism, of course, British imperialism, and that historically it had been part of the Ottoman province, which then became Iraq.
Saddam had many good reasons for invading Kuwait, reasons which he gave to his brother Arabs. These were the noble, all-embracing reasons, the liberation from the West. What Saddam didn't mention, but of course the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times are talking about at considerable length, was the fact that Iraq was at $90 billion in debt after its war with Iran.
Saddam had bankrupted Iraq fighting the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. In early 1990s, Saddam was trying to find ways of easing the financial burden on his country. He looked to Kuwait for a moratorium on the debts that they owed from the war. He looked to use his oil revenues to decrease his debt. The problem there was that Kuwait allegedly, according to Saddam, was actually overproducing their oil, exceeding the OPEC oil quotas, and therefore flooding the oil market, lowering the global price of oil. And Saddam's economists reckon that every dollar off the price of oil reduced Iraq's export revenue by $1 billion a year.
So from a money point of view, Iraq wants to take Kuwait in order to be able to control Kuwait's oil production, to keep production levels lower, thus to keep the price of oil higher. And the higher the price of oil, the more money Saddam Hussein has coming in.
Meeting an emergency session, the United Nations Security Council's Resolution 660 promptly condemned the invasion and demanded an immediate Iraqi withdrawal. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President George Bush then called for the establishment of an international military coalition to compel Saddam's withdrawal, while the UN instituted economic sanctions against Iraq. In response, Saddam annexed Kuwait and appeared to concentrate his forces on Kuwait's border with Saudi Arabia.
Saddam seems to have expected that the outside world would be unhappy with the invasion, but that the outside world would not react militarily to the invasion. He sees the United States hampered by the failings of Vietnam, and therefore unlikely to resort to force, and as a society, unwilling to take the risks of a resort to force.
Western leaders concluded that Saddam intended to invade Saudi Arabia and thus control its vast oil reserves.
There was absolutely nothing between Saddam's very formidable divisions and the Saudi oil fields. It was simply a military promenade. It would be a matter of simply driving south a couple of 100 kilometers. All he needed to do was to maintain the vehicles, keep up the fuel, and he could get there. There was precious little that Saudi Arabian forces could actually do to stop him getting to the oil fields.
If successful, this aggression would enable Saddam to hold the Western world to ransom by manipulating the price of oil. This fear of economic damage to America proved pivotal in persuading President Bush to intervene militarily in this Middle Eastern crisis, even though previous regional problems had not prompted such an American response. Bush reacted swiftly to this apparent threat by initiating Operation Desert Shield on the 8th of August, with the dispatch of the 82nd U.S. Airborne Division to northern Saudi Arabia to deter future Iraqi aggression. That same day, Britain and France announced their intention to send contingents to augment America's Desert Shield forces.
There's a feeling of excitement buzzing around, which I'm sure you can feel. The boys in the sheds woke up this morning with a purpose, going to get the kit unloaded, and really looking forward to getting out into the desert and working alongside the American Marines. It's very exciting.
In turn, Saddam sought to internationalize the conflict into a pan-Arab holy war. He called on the United Arab world to expel the infidel Western forces in the region. He linked any Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait to the departure of Israeli forces from occupied Palestinian territory, and he threatened to unleash chemical weapons against Israel if the coalition attacked Iraq. During September, the military coalition continued to assemble in northern Saudi Arabia. The force came under the authority of the U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, then led by the mercurial commander, General Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf.
There are a number of people that really disliked Schwarzkopf. His potential for arrogance, for flippancy, his very dry sense of humour. He often came across as brusque. There were others that really got on well with him because he spoke his mind. He was a very intelligent, professional military man.
During September, it still seemed that sanctions and diplomacy might peacefully resolve the crisis. However, in late October, an increasingly impatient Bush resolved to use military force to liberate Kuwait. But Bush insisted that the US forces deployed in the Gulf be doubled before the coalition commenced its operations. To achieve these force levels, the Americans subsequently redeployed the 7th US Corps, then stationed in Germany, to Saudi Arabia. On the 29th of November, UN Resolution 678 approved Bush's decision to use force by authorizing the coalition to employ all possible means to reverse Iraq's aggression. The resolution gave Saddam until the 15th of January 1991 to withdraw from Kuwaiti soil, after which the coalition would employ military force to compel his withdrawal. During December and into January 1991, Bush went an extra mile for peace through further diplomacy, but continuing Iraqi obstruction merely infuriated America's diplomats.
Once Iraq invades Kuwait, Saddam is in an awkward position when he realizes that he is not going to be allowed to stay in Kuwait. Consequently, he has to construct a situation in which he can be seen in some way the heroic victim or the fighter for Arab rights. Saddam himself required heroic defeat rather than humiliating withdrawal, and Bush required something similar, but from the other perspective.
Let's get into this war. I call upon all Arabs to start a holy war.
Consequently, the vital deadline of the 15th of January came and passed. That night, the world held its breath, awaiting news of the outbreak of war in the Middle East. Yet all remained quiet. Millions of people across the globe had only to wait a little longer, however, before hostilities commenced with a vengeance. For at 2:10 a.m. local time on the 17th of January 1991, President Bush ordered Operation Desert Storm, the air campaign, to begin, with coalition warships launching 52 Tomahawk cruise missiles towards targets deep inside Iraq. Thundering across the darkened skies at 550 miles per hour, the deadly missiles navigated themselves towards their targets using the digitized mapping data their targeting software contained. Simultaneously, 700 coalition aircraft commenced strikes against targets across Iraq. In Baghdad, camera-laden Western journalists endeavored to capture the startling sights and sounds of those first hours of the war. Darkness gradually extended through Baghdad as its electricity generation facilities succumbed to coalition strikes. But the hundreds of streams of tracer fired from the city's anti-aircraft guns nevertheless eerily eased the darkness. Intermittently violent eruptions illuminated the night as coalition missiles and bombs found their targets with devastating effect. Many of those deadly strikes against Baghdad that night had been delivered by dozens of small, angular black aircraft that had streaked their way largely unnoticed through the darkness. These black jets were American Nighthawk stealth aircraft on their way to devastate key strategic targets located within the Iraqi capital.
The F-117A Nighthawk was one of the most famous weapons of war used during the Gulf War, the stealth fighter, the fighter that was, in inverted commas, invisible to the enemy. And it was, of course, used in the initial air campaign to try and fly stealthily towards the enemy air defences, normally with a partner. And whilst one illuminated the target, the other one would then fly its laser-guided weapon system onto the target and destroy them.
Saddam reacted to these airstrikes by stepping up his propaganda war. He believed that Western public opinion could not tolerate sustaining heavy casualties during the liberation of Kuwait, whereas his own people could bear such privations. Consequently, Saddam chillingly promised to turn the conflict into a bloodbath for coalition soldiers by making it the mother of all battles. On the 18th of January, Saddam fired al-Hussein's Scud missiles into Israel and Saudi Arabia. A modified Iraqi version of the relatively inaccurate Soviet Scud-B short-range ballistic missile, the al-Hussein could deliver a 550-pound warhead onto a town-sized target up to an impressive range of 400 miles away. The widespread assumption that these missiles carried the chemical warheads that Saddam previously had threatened to use created panic within Israel. Saddam calculated that if Israel entered the war against Iraq, the Arab contingents within the coalition would withdraw, as fighting alongside the hated Israelis would have been utterly unacceptable to any Arab leader. Such a development, Saddam reckoned, would destroy the notion that the coalition represented the consensus opinion of the international community, rather than the aims of a hawkish President Bush and his cronies, including the new British Prime Minister, John Major. In response, America rushed Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries to Israel to shoot down Saddam's incoming Scuds. Partly through this measure, the US hoped Israel would be persuaded not to retaliate against Iraq. Simultaneously, the coalition intensified the efforts already being undertaken by its special forces and aircraft to destroy Saddam's elusive mobile Scud missile launchers. During the rest of January, the Great Scud Hunt dominated coalition strategy.
Initially they relied on air power, but the problem for air power in negating the threat was that the Iraqis used shoot and scoot tactics. They set the missile launchers up, fire the missile, and then dash off to some concealment, perhaps under a bridge or in a concealed bunker. By the time the coalition aircraft arrived, there was nothing to target. And so the coalition turned to their special forces, American special forces and the British SAS, dropped behind enemy lines to try and deal with the Scud threat.
The special forces had to find those missiles in the moments between the commander stopping the vehicle and erecting the missile and launching the missile, or alternatively, stopping, not erecting and launching the missile and driving on to somewhere else. They had to discriminate between dummy missiles and dummy transporters on the ground and the real thing. And they did a very good job, the special forces, but they didn't get all of the Scud missiles and their launchers. They couldn't realistically hope to get all of them. And as long as Saddam Hussein still had his modified Scud missiles, he could continue to attack the coalition forces and could continue to attack the Israelis in their effort to provoke the Israelis into entering the war.
In those first days of the air war, the coalition concentrated on the strategic mission of gaining aerial superiority over the Kuwaiti theater. The coalition achieved this by striking Saddam's strategic infrastructure for controlling the Iraqi war machine, particularly the national intercept centers of the Kari air defense system. These vital facilities acquired and distributed the essential battle management data that the Iraqi Air Force needed if it was to stand any chance of opposing coalition control of the skies. The first few hours of coalition airstrikes left the Iraqi Air Force bereft of this battle management data. Consequently, an already beleaguered Iraqi Air Force found itself woefully outclassed, both technologically and in terms of the professional skills its pilots possessed. Very quickly, the Iraqi Air Force surrendered the skies to the coalition, either hiding timidly in its hardened bunkers or scuttling ignominiously off to the safety of internment in Iran, Iraq's neutral eastern neighbor. The origins of these strategic aspects of the coalition air campaign lay in Operation Instant Thunder, the plan drawn up by Colonel John Warden back in August 1990. This scheme envisaged a 6-day strategic air effort that alone would destroy Iraq and force Saddam to withdraw. Warden believed firmly in the potency of strategic air power, that an independent air effort could win a war without ground action being necessary.
Colonel Warden's Instant Thunder plan was based on his earlier 5 circles concept, which outlines his view on the nature of modern war. Warden saw the modern battle as a dartboard with 5 rings. In the inner ring was the enemy's strategic C4I capability, that's command, control, computers, communications and intelligence, their strategic decision-making capabilities. And Instant Thunder was based on the assumption that a short, strategic air campaign focused on the inner ring would smash Saddam's ability to control not just the Iraqi state, but the Iraqi war machine at the strategic level. And that would collapse the Iraqi state and allow for the liberation of Kuwait without any ground forces even being necessary.
Even though Schwarzkopf remained unconvinced by these ambitious claims, Instant Thunder became the basis of the air plan finalized by mid-January 1991. The final air plan, however, was more extensive in duration and scope than Instant Thunder, and combined Warden's strategic aspects with extensive attritional efforts, primarily by B-52 bombers, to weaken the Iraqi forces deployed in the Kuwaiti theater. Indeed, Schwarzkopf stated that these attritional efforts had to degrade Iraqi ground strength by 50% before the coalition ground war could commence. In fact, the actual 43-day-long coalition air war comprised of 4 very distinct elements.
The 4 phases of the coalition air campaign started with perhaps the most important, the gaining of air supremacy. The gaining of air supremacy allowed the Allies quite quickly to dominate the air flank, and therefore to be able to do with the air flank what they wished, to go on bombing raids, to transport airborne troops, to fly their helicopters, to resupply logistically for battlefield air interdiction and close air support, all the things that were going to follow. The second phase was the bombing of strategic targets, making it very difficult for the enemy to sustain violence against the coalition, hitting bridges, oil refineries, ammunition dumps, even nuclear power stations, rendering it very difficult for them to project their force.
The third phase became more important as the air war moved closer to the initiation of the ground offensive. This was the preparing the battlefield phase. This was the phase of attacking the Iraqi ground forces in the Kuwaiti theatre. Once the ground war started, the air war moved into its 4th phase, operations to support the ongoing ground offensive. This would involve close air support to the contact battle, and also aerial interdiction missions attacking enemy reserves and forces deep behind the front line.
During late January 1991, as the aerial devastation of Iraq continued, the relative quiet of the coalition's ground positions in northern Saudi Arabia was rudely shattered. From the 29th to the 31st of January, Iraqi forces launched a successful surprise attack on the Saudi border town of Al-Khafji. Simultaneously, American space satellites and J-STARS intelligence aircraft detected additional Iraqi tank columns moving south toward Al-Khafji to exploit the initial Iraqi success. Reacting quickly, coalition commanders employed tank-busting aircraft and assault helicopters, as well as ground firepower, to intercept and destroy these columns.
Finally, Saddam realized just how devastating coalition military strength was. Saddam had got to the point where he realized that there was nothing going to stop some form of ground offensive. And Tariq Aziz, the acceptable face of the regime, I suppose, makes it clear that Iraq is willing to unconditionally and immediately withdraw from Kuwait. But of course, it doesn't fit into American and Western requirements as it would enable Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait, retain his weapons of mass destruction, retain his armed forces intact, and to some extent play the part of the injured party to the Arab world.
I'm now going to show you.
As the relentless aerial strikes continued into mid-February, Bush rejected Saddam's proposed conditional withdrawal, and all thoughts turned to the now imminent ground war.
Through the crosshairs.
By now, the coalition believed its air campaign to have been so accurate that collateral civilian casualties had been minimized. Events like the bombing of the Amaria shelter on the 13th of February, where 200 civilians died, remained rare exceptions.
The air campaign was being sold to the media as a campaign in which civilians were not going to die, or at least they were not going to die unnecessarily. This was a high technology campaign where missiles were going to be guided through windows. This was where cruise missiles could fly up main streets and hit a target with a precision which was undreamed of. Not 40 years earlier in the Second World War, but 10 years earlier. And unfortunately, sometimes it went wrong.
By now, the coalition air campaign had proved devastatingly effective. It had smashed Saddam's ability to control his forces, had destroyed his army's logistical infrastructure and maneuver capabilities, and devastated Iraq's industrial base. Yet Iraq's battered military machine did not collapse as Warden had predicted. Indeed, it continued to function, albeit only after a fashion.
Although the coalition aerial assault did a lot of damage to Iraqi command and control, landlines managed to survive most of the attack. And it was relatively easy to put out new landlines, with the result that although Iraqi communications were compromised, they were never actually destroyed. And it's quite clear from the movement of Iraqi troops during the ground war, in particular the Iraqi attempt to block 7th Corps in southern Iraq, that Iraq retained its ability to communicate with its military formations.
Air power had not, after all, won the war by itself, and so the coalition readied itself for ground operations.
Once the air forces had weakened the enemy, made them deaf, dumb and blind, it was up to the ground forces then to go in and to wrap up the situation, to destroy them, to take them out of Kuwait City and bring the war to an end. But undoubtedly, the air campaign made that possible.
In the following weeks, the American 7th and 18th Corps secretly redeployed behind the US Marines in the east to assume new positions 200 miles farther west around Rafah. Schwarzkopf had switched the main effort of the coalition ground offensive way out west to outflank and envelop Saddam's frontier defense line. Schwarzkopf's final strategy for the ground war represented a well-orchestrated operational-level master plan. Each of its various elements dovetailed together to produce a synchronized effort that would swiftly deliver decisive success. The first element of the plan involved attacks by US Marines and Arab forces in the east, striking directly towards Kuwait City. Simultaneously, Marine amphibious forces would maintain the deception of an impending amphibious assault on the Kuwaiti coast.
In order to ensure that the Iraqi army held still for the operations that the coalition was going to conduct, they had to fix the Iraqi army in place. And the way that the coalition fixes the Iraqi army is by moving on Kuwait City. That focuses the Iraqis' attention on Kuwait. It ensures that they can't easily turn around to fight the coalition's more mobile armored forces in Iraq because they are in the middle of fighting in and around Kuwait.
Once these attacks had started, the main coalition thrust would commence out in the west, beyond the main Iraqi defense line. While French forces would advance to screen the coalition's left flank, Lieutenant General Frank's 7th US Corps would swing east in a great left hook to crush the Iraqi forces in the Kuwaiti theater, particularly the Republican Guard, against the sea. Simultaneously, the 1st UK Armoured Division would advance to protect the inner flank of the 7th Corps' advance. On the northern or outer flank of Frank's advance, the 101st US Airborne Division was to initiate a series of air assaults deep into Iraq to establish forward operating bases astride Highway 8 along the Euphrates Valley, thus blocking Iraqi reinforcements attempting to reach the Kuwaiti theater.
The policy is get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And not an ounce of effort is expended in the Gulf War on anything else.
Some analysts have expressed surprise that the coalition didn't pursue their advance beyond the Euphrates River up towards Baghdad. The key reasons that the coalition stopped short of attacking Baghdad are mainly political. The mandate that they were pursuing, the UN resolutions, was to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. Whether that mandate actually allowed the coalition to operate on Iraqi territory at all was certainly subject to some debate.
Logistically, they had no chance of mounting a very swift attack once they'd driven through Kuwait into Iraq and towards Baghdad. They needed time to refit and reorganise themselves, by which time the Iraqis would have dug in, been perhaps much more passionate about defending their own ground, and a whole new Gulf War would have developed around that situation.
Schwarzkopf's ground war plan supposedly implemented the new American maneuverist doctrine of air-land battle. Introduced in the early 1980s, this doctrine sought to restore decisiveness to warfare by using maneuver rather than traditional American attritional approaches. To do this, air-land battle targeted enemy centers of gravity, such as command and control, in order to destroy their cohesion. The doctrine also envisaged a joint campaign effort by air, naval, marine, and army forces that employed cutting-edge technology to see deep, far into enemy territory, and then to strike deep using aircraft, artillery, and missiles. Consequently, the modern air-land battlefield would be a complicated, non-linear one that would place significant demands on command and control. Air-land battle doctrine also advocates the development of fast-paced and synchronized joint military operations that reflect the principles of agility and depth.
There were certain aspects of air-land battle in this campaign. Not the slightest doubt about that. But the reality was that the Americans engaged in an attritional battle. That divisions like the Tawakana, like the Medina, actually stood their ground, and in some cases fought extremely well. And it was only the fact that they were outgunned by massively superior technology that actually prevented them from, on occasions, inflicting very severe damage on American forces.
By the 24th of February 1991, the coalition believed that 500,000 Iraqi soldiers faced its forces in the Kuwaiti theater. But in reality, many Iraqi divisions had been under strength before they even arrived in Kuwait. Indeed, by the start of the ground war, the combination of coalition aerial strikes and mass desertion had further reduced this figure to about 250,000 troops. To resist the attempted coalition liberation of occupied Kuwait, Saddam adopted a static defensive strategy. He seems to have hoped that a ground war might never actually begin. If it did, Saddam expected the coalition merely to confine its operations to Kuwaiti soil rather than that of Iraq.
Saddam thinks about military activity with a highly politicized pair of spectacles on. As a result, he believed that the West would find it politically very difficult to actually go into Iraq proper. In addition, Saddam looks at the United States as a country which is going to fear a sort of second Vietnam and going to fear the entanglement that an invasion of Iraq itself might actually produce.
Should military action be required, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be a protracted, drawn-out war.
In the event of a ground war, the most Saddam could hope for was to force a face-saving compromise deal on the coalition by inflicting heavy casualties on them. Hence, his forces established defenses that aimed to channel attacking coalition forces into pre-surveyed killing zones, where concentrated artillery fire would inflict severe casualties. At worst, Saddam feared that he would be expelled from Kuwait, but without his iron grip on Iraq being threatened in the process. Losing Kuwait would have been a strategic setback, but not a disastrous one for Saddam, because his forces had already extensively looted the emirate and because he could portray this failure as the heroic defeat of a strong Arab leader who had dared to resist neo-imperialist Western intervention in the region.
The real nightmare scenario for Saddam was a military campaign that not just liberated Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, but in the process undermined his control over the Iraqi state.
Now, what Saddam didn't fully appreciate is that no member of the coalition had the slightest intention of removing him from Iraq. They might have been delighted if Saddam had actually fallen or fallen to an assassin's bullet, but there was not the slightest intention that he should be removed from Iraq by force.
At 4 a.m. on the 24th of February 1991, the ground war commenced, with coalition forces striking the Iraqi defenses that faced the northern border of Saudi Arabia. By then, Saddam had positioned 24 regular army infantry divisions along this border as a first line of defense. Behind these positions, Saddam had concentrated his most effective ground formations in northwestern Kuwait or west of Kuwait's border with Iraq. This mobile reserve comprised 8 regular army divisions, together with 7 elite divisions of Saddam's politically reliable Republican Guard. The latter represented a key target that Schwarzkopf's ground plan intended to destroy.
The Republican Guard was not just a better equipped, better trained, more motivated part of the Iraqi armed forces. The Republican Guard was a separate armed force which was especially politically reliable, that was especially responsible to the Iraqi regime.
The deployment, therefore, of the Republican Guard might be seen in 2 ways. The first way, it might be seen as the sword that was actually behind the shield. Once the shield cracked open, the counter-attacking forces of the Republican Guard would be able to push the coalition back from whence they came, or in fact destroy them. Actually, they were deployed in the northern region of the Kuwaiti theatre of operations so that they could run away, so that they wouldn't be destroyed, if at all possible, by the rampaging coalition forces once they broke through, so they could get back to Baghdad and do their primary job in terms of political defence of the Ba'athist regime, and Saddam Hussein in particular.
During the morning of the 24th of February, the first US Marine and Arab assaults into southeastern Kuwait overran the entrenched Iraqi defences more easily than the coalition had expected. This unanticipated success forced Schwarzkopf to initiate the 7th Corps assault that same afternoon, earlier than planned. That evening, General Franks's divisions quickly breached the weak western end of Iraq's frontier defense line. During the following day, Franks's corps, urged on by Schwarzkopf, conducted a depth battle, using aircraft, attack helicopters, and long-range missiles to soften up targets behind the current front line before then engaging them. By using these tactics, 7th Corps rapidly advanced northeast across the flat, featureless, sandy terrain to overrun successive Iraqi positions. The thousands of coalition vehicles did not get lost, however, thanks to their use of the new Global Positioning System, GPS technology.
Out in a flat, featureless desert, getting lost using conventional mapping would be very, very easy indeed. With GPS, military forces could know where they were in the middle of the night, in the middle of a sandstorm.
Also absolutely crucial, and going hand in hand with the global positioning systems at night, was something called TOGs, thermal optical gun sights, which meant that with the ability to understand exactly where they were and exactly where the enemy were, they could actually engage the enemy at night. Using the thermals that the enemy's vehicles actually gave off, they could actually attack an enemy at a range of about 2,500 metres, which meant that before the enemy even knew that the coalition forces were there, and especially the Americans and the British using these systems, they were dead.
During the 24th and 25th of February, as Franks's army charged northeast in a great wheel, the 101st US Airborne Division launched a series of air assaults up to 110 miles deep into Iraqi territory to isolate the Kuwaiti theatre from any Iraqi reinforcements. Meanwhile, in the east, the gung-ho US Marines continued their frontal assault towards Kuwaiti City. The early successes achieved by every coalition assault during the first 24 hours of the ground war prompted Saddam to order a phased withdrawal north out of Kuwait on the 25th of February. This withdrawal, however, soon degenerated into a rout characterized by mass surrenders. Some dispirited Iraqi soldiers even surrendered to an unmanned reconnaissance plane. Meanwhile, out in the west, during the 26th of February, General Franks's divisions continued to thunder rapidly east, past the Wadi al-Batin, in the process devastating the Tawakkalna Republican Guard Division in the Battle of the 73rd Easting. That same day, coalition intelligence detected that some of Saddam's Republican Guard were preparing to withdraw north, and this prompted Schwarzkopf to demand that Franks speed up the advance of his forces. These repeated demands provoked a furious disagreement that day between the more cautious Franks and the CENTCOM commander, a row subsequently fueled by Franks' decision to halt some of his divisions that night.
In the interest of not allowing one division to get too far ahead to expose its flanks, Franks has got to stop some of his formations to let others catch up.
The main reason why Franks decided to halt his divisions at night on certain occasions was not fear of enemy action, but rather fear of blue-on-blue incidents, friendly fire incidents from his own forces in confused night fighting operations.
The sheer speed of advance achieved by coalition forces made it increasingly difficult to identify them from enemy ones on this now fluid battlefield. Unfortunately, several friendly fire incidents resulted. On the afternoon of the 26th of February, for example, an American A-10 Warthog plane destroyed 2 British Warrior armored vehicles, killing 9 soldiers. These sad incidents highlighted the fact that friendly fire now represented as great a threat to the coalition as the enemy.
It was very difficult to actually recognise who was friendly and who was enemy on the battlefield. The technology at the time, which had very much developed as a result of the Vietnam War, was directed towards finding out what movement there was on the battlefield. But it didn't differentiate between friendly forces and enemy forces. And often when quick decisions are required on the battlefield, very chaotic, very high odds, mistakes were made.
In the Gulf War, the level of casualties from enemy fire to the coalition forces was very, very low. And that meant that deaths from friendly fire became a much larger proportion of those killed. If the enemy isn't killing your people, then the few who are killed by friendly fire become a larger proportion of the statistics.
During the 27th of February, the 7th and 18th US Corps thrust into western Kuwait to converge on the coalition forces then advancing north beyond Kuwait City along the eastern seaboard. Late that day, however, shocking images began to flood the world's media, depicting the carnage that coalition air power had inflicted on the Iraqi forces who had attempted to escape from Kuwait north along the Basra Road. In what became known as the Basra Road Syndrome, these images quickly altered world opinion, creating the belief that the war had degenerated into the murderous rout of a beaten force by the awesomely powerful coalition. Fearing a powerful political backlash, consequently the coalition announced a ceasefire at 8 a.m. on the 28th of February, exactly 100 hours after the ground campaign had begun. Throughout this 4-day ground campaign, coalition forces had encountered only modest Iraqi resistance. This fact goes a long way to explaining the unbelievably low casualty rate that the coalition suffered in the conflict, with a total of just 170 battle casualties. In fact, the Iraqis, despite their significant forces and modern equipment, performed unimpressively during the conflict, as evidenced by the capture of 48,000 Iraqi soldiers in just 100 hours of battle.
There is a brilliant computer model which in recent years has shown that if you model the battles of the Gulf War on a computer, and if on that computer you increase the level of Iraqi training, suddenly the war is much less one-sided than it was. It's not so much that the Iraqi soldier was less motivated than the coalition soldier, although he was. The real difference in the Gulf War comes from the fact that the coalition soldiers were very much better trained than the Iraqi soldiers.
On the day following the ceasefire, Iraq announced its compliance with all the UN resolutions concerning the invasion of Kuwait. Soon after, the Shiite and Kurdish minorities in southern and northern Iraq respectively rose up in rebellion against Saddam. However, the coalition, now anxious to disengage from the region, refused to intervene in what they described as an internal Iraqi affair. This disinterest encouraged Saddam, who dispatched his surviving Republican guards to suppress these rebellions. Then, in the following months, UN weapons inspectors began the difficult job of locating and dismantling Saddam's facility for making nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons.
The defeat doesn't necessarily erode Saddam's control over Iraq. In many ways, it reinforces it. Partly because it enables Saddam to square the circle that he'd been facing since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, in that he told the Iraqis they'd won a great victory, but their economy and their standard of living was severely damaged. Now he has a wonderful excuse for Iraq's problems in the form of the coalition and what it's done.
Saddam remained in power. The subsequent attempts to dismantle his weapons of mass destruction, his chemical, biological and possibly nuclear capabilities, met with some success, but faced constant bureaucratic obstruction and prevarication from within Iraq.
At the strategic level, the Gulf War was an unqualified success. Saddam Hussein could not control the price of oil in the world. At an operational level, it did not achieve all of its aims, but it doesn't matter. As long as you achieve your strategic aims, then you can walk away and say that that was a victory.
Today, Saddam Hussein still controls Iraq and still seems to pose a threat to the region. Through dogged obstructionism, Saddam eventually even managed to rid himself of the UN weapons inspectors. In their absence, Iraq has reportedly begun to rebuild its weapons of mass destruction.